Okay, so in this talk, we are going to go into the first theory that we look at in the philosophy of mind called substance dualism. I've already explained in a previous video that this effectively comes from René Descartes, and it's most explicitly expounded in the Meditations on First Philosophy. So substance dualism is effectively the belief that there are two fundamental categories in existence, and two fundamental categories of substance. There are physical substances and mental substances. So if you don't remember from previously, a substance is a thing which continues to exist while its properties may change. I used the example of my glasses. I said that my glasses can be the same glasses as they were a year ago, even though the lenses have changed. Perhaps they've been coloured differently, or they've been repaired, or something like that. So the properties of a substance can change and the subject stays the same. The substance stays the same. The subject doesn't need the properties, but the properties need the substance or the subject. So you have two different kinds of substance. You have physical substances, which according to Descartes are extended. The essence of them is to be extended. They're extended in three-dimensional space. And then you have mental substances. These are substances that are immaterial and unextended. And these substances are the things that stay the same while thoughts change. And the most natural thing, of course, to think about that is yourself. So you are a mental or an immaterial substance with properties of changing thoughts and feelings and so on and so forth. Okay, so we come to the question which I earlier claimed, which is the key question in the philosophy of mind. Is the mind a substance or a property? And with Descartes, it's clear from the off that the mind is a substance. It's that thing which stays the same while its properties change. It is not a property. The mind is not a property. So there are two arguments that Descartes gives for substance dualism. And we'll see that actually, strictly speaking, he's a strange kind of substance dualist. It's not as clear as some people like to make out. Descartes has a quite sophisticated view of substance dualism. Well, there's two kinds of arguments. There's the first argument, it's the argument from conceivability. And the second argument is the argument from division. So let's look at those. So the argument from conceivability is found in the Meditations, and I'm going to read it to you. It's important that we look at the primary sources, that we look in a little bit of detail at them, to really know that you're looking at what Descartes said and what someone said about Descartes. So, first I know that everything which I clearly and distinctively understand is capable of being created by God so as to correspond exactly with my understanding of it. Hence the fact that I can clearly and distinctly understand one thing apart from another is enough to make me certain that the two things are distinct, since they're capable of being separated, at least by God. So the idea here is that if you can conceive two things being separated, say a triangle from a colour, you might have a blue triangle, but you could separate the colour and the triangle out into two different things. You might have a tree and a garden, and you could separate the tree out from the garden. So if you can conceive the separation of two things, then God, being the kind of powerful being that it is, or he is, can separate those two things. God's all powerful. So let's continue. Thus, simply by knowing that I exist and seeing at the same time that absolutely nothing else belongs to my nature or essence except that I am a thinking thing, I can infer correctly that my essence consists solely in the fact that I am a thinking thing. It's important to understand that when Descartes, what we translate as thinking, Descartes, cogitato, it also means willing, wanting, fearing. It effectively means all the modes of consciousness that there are. It's not just thinking. It's true that I may have a body that is closely conjoined to me, but nevertheless, on the one hand, I have a clear and distinct idea of a body, insofar as this is simply an extended non-thinking thing, and accordingly it's certain that I am really distinct from my body and can exist without it. So effectively the claim is here that Descartes can imagine his mind and his body being separated. Now, we're not talking about imagining it from the outside. He's not imagining someone else's mind and bodies being separated. He's imagining his mind leaving his body. Insofar as he can imagine that, he can understand that, knowing God is omnipotent, he therefore knows that that could happen if God so wished it. This is important because God plays a fundamental role here in the way the logic of this works, and we'll see that a bit later. So we could put this quite simply in the following argument. 1, I am possibly such as to be not extended. 2, no physical body is possibly such as to be non-extended. 3, conclusion, therefore I am not a body. That's the logic of the argument. There are quite a few objections. I've put 4 down, which I think are worth knowing. 2 of them are by Zimmerman, and the other 2 you'll find anywhere. The first one says, look, we're not conscious when we're in deep sleep, but we still exist. So to claim that it's essential to be conscious or to be thinking in order to be as a mental substance doesn't stand up to scrutiny, because there's times where your consciousness switches off. You still exist. So how does Descartes make sense of that? 2, we must assume that no individual thing can pass from being extended to being non-extended. Think of the Cheshire Cat in Alice in Wonderland, or Alice with the Looking Glass. Cheshire Cat is a 3-dimensional cat, right? And the Cheshire Cat slowly disappears limb by limb. And then finally there's the face and the head, and then that disappears, and all that is left is a 2-dimensional grin. So you could logically imagine something 3-dimensional changing and transmogrifying, if you like, into something non-extended. And this is an idea that Suarez came up with as well. I'm thinking about cone and how a cone could disappear to its most accurate point at the end of the cone, but it's just 1-dimensional. So is that still a cone? Now, if that's possible, then we can go from 3-dimension to either 1-dimension or no dimension, in which case then you can have the same thing go across dimensions. 3 is the eye a substance? It could be a bundle. And if you remember back to previous discussions, we've spoken about Hume saying, well, look, he can't see in looking and attending at his mind anything that stays the same. If you remember back to that metaphor of the basketball team I gave you, there's the team and there's all the changes that occur in that, and there's no one thing that stays the same. We talk as if there's a basketball team, some kind of abstract thing, but in fact there isn't. There's just all the different things that come together, sometimes known as the category error. And then 4th, we have conceivability doesn't imply possibility. In other words, just because something can be understood or imagined doesn't mean it's actually possible. I'm going to go into that in some detail in a separate video. It's a very important discussion that kind of comes in and out of the philosophy of mind and actually metaphysics generally. So it's worth paying attention to that. One of the things Descartes can say against at least the first claim, if something passing from being 3-dimensional to being 1-dimensional or non-dimensional, is that if something did that, it wouldn't be the thing at the end that it was at the beginning. In fact, it wouldn't be the same thing. The reason for that is that if something loses its essence, it ceases to be. So the argument here would be something like, when the Cheshire Cat finally becomes a grin, that grin is not the Cheshire Cat. It's something different. Something essentially different from the Cheshire Cat. That may well be true. It's not clear how we should think about that. It's important to understand the significance of God in Descartes' thinking, because God's the thing that makes our leap from imagining something to be possible, thinking something could be possible, like 2 things being separated, from it to it being possible. So, for example, if I believe there's a God, and I believe that water is H2O, it may be the case that I could imagine God making water something else and it staying water. It may be the case that I could imagine God, for example, taking out the genetic DNA of a person and the person staying the same. If there isn't a God, that doesn't make sense. So though it seems logically possible that you could separate someone's DNA sequence from their identity, or you could separate some chemical composition from being water, the reality is that isn't possible. It's metaphysically impossible. The laws of physics don't allow that to happen. So you need God. Descartes needs God for his conceivability argument to work, or at least it's really important for that. The second argument is the argument from division. The argument from division works on a really important premise, which we call Leibniz's principle of the identity of indiscernibles. I'll say that again, the principle of the identity of indiscernibles. That principle says that X and Y are the same if they share all the same properties. So for example, the morning star and the evening star are the same, because the morning star has all the properties that the evening star has, and the evening star has all the properties that the morning star has. You see, you understand that the idea of the morning star and the evening star might be different, but they point to the same planet. Now, the claim here is that if something has a property, if X, let's say, had a property that Y didn't have, then they wouldn't be the same, because the principle of identity claims they must have the same properties. And the argument here is going to say that my soul cannot be divided, but my body can. And if my soul can't be divided and my body can be divided, there's something they don't share, this property of being divisible. If they don't share it, there's a distinction, there's a difference. So let's read that. When I consider the mind, i.e. consider myself purely as a thinking thing, I can't detect any part within myself. I understand myself to be something single and complete. The faculties of willing, of understanding, of sensory perception, and so on. These are not parts of the mind, since it's only one and the same mind that wills, understands, and perceives. So what are the objections to the divisibility argument? So just to make clear about that, by the way, so you can divide the body, right? You can divide a three-dimensional body up into smaller and smaller pieces, but you can't divide consciousness. That's the claim here. You can't divide the mind. The mind has this simplicity, this conscious unity, which doesn't belong to extended external objects. So there's two objections that we can make against this. The first is that the mind is divisible, and in fact the mind is divisible in different ways. So one is to say it's psychologically divisible. If you ever study, Freud or any other psychology, you'll understand that they work with the concept of the unconscious, the subconscious, the id, what we present to the world, and that different aspects of our psyche have different functions. And so in that sense, consciousness is divided, because you may not even have access to some of your desires or your wishes and so on and so forth. They may be split in some sense from your surface consciousness. Descartes would probably say, in response to that, when he talks about division of consciousness, he doesn't mean division in function, he means actual division in physical space, or at least division in the entity itself. We can't understand it to be divided. He might respond in that way. But there's a second form of division of consciousness which is more serious. As some philosophers claim, Jerry Valberg's one of these philosophers in his book Dream, Death and Self, he claims that if the brain could be divided right down the middle through the temporal lobes, there is evidence that the consciousness itself could be split. So what we're saying here is that your consciousness, that single unified consciousness that you currently now have, could be divided into two different consciousnesses. That wouldn't mean that you would experience that necessarily from the inside as division, but there would be a multiplication of consciousness. Now, if that's true, and consciousness can be divided in that very deep way, then Descartes would have a problem, because if consciousness can be divided, then it shares that property with physical substances. Now, there could be a lot of debate about that. It's not clear whether that's possible or not, but it may be. Descartes makes the following quote: "Nature teaches me, by these sensations of pain, hunger, thirst, and so on, that I'm not merely present in my body as a sailor is present in a ship, but that I'm very closely joined and, as it were, intermingled with it, so that I and the body form a unit." Now, I add this on, it's really important, that Descartes was fully aware that the mind and body are not connected like a person in a car or a sailor in a ship, where the ship could be damaged and the person's unharmed, or the car could crash and doesn't affect the person. He's aware that there's a deep intermingling between those two elements. And so Descartes speaks of the person as a third basic unit, like you could imagine it like how salt dissolves in water. Now that claim means that Descartes has a more sophisticated form of dualism than you might just think from the off. He understands that the body and soul are intermingled in a very intimate way, but he understands there's a formal distinction between the mind and the body, and that formal distinction can be made a real distinction if God so wished it to be. Okay, see you next time.